Good evening and welcome to the 12th home edition of ALFILM. I am Pascale Fakhry, the artistic director of the festival, and I am so happy to have with me Nadir Bouhmouch, director of AMUSSU this evening. Nadir, we were supposed to talk yesterday and it didn't happen. Can I ask you what happened?
Yes, and I'm very embarrassed about it.
Don't be.
I was location scouting in the Atlas, and I didn't verify whether I would have an internet connection where I was, and so that's why I missed the talk yesterday. I'm really sorry about that.
Well, don't worry about it, because being in the Atlas, we understand, we envy you a little bit. We wish we would have been able to be there. And we are very happy that this is happening tonight. I am definitely, because I was looking forward to our conversation. AMUSSU is such an intriguing and unconventional film on so many levels, on the narrative level, on the aesthetic level, and also a lot on the production level. And I'm really happy to be discussing all that with you. If I was to describe AMUSSU, I would call it a collective militant poem. And you are also a very unconventional, non-traditional filmmaker. In 2011, you directed and produced your first work, My Marsen and Me, a documentary about Morocco's February 20th uprising. And it was the first documentary about a mass social movement in Morocco. So it was not, it was censored from national festivals. Your other works include Tin Nadin Rif. Am I saying that correctly?
Nadir.
A performative documentary, and Paradises of the Earth, a short web documentary series on the environmental causes of the Tunisian Revolution. Produced collectively by the villagers of Nadir, your latest film, AMUSSU, premiered at Hot Docs and the International Documentary Festival of Amsterdam. You are also a militant activist, and you have published various articles and essays, including The Reef and the Moroccan State's Economic Pressure Cooker, Morocco, Green for the Rich, Grey for the Poor, and Experiment for a Cinema from Below. So this is all very interesting, and I am very happy to be soon talking about AMUSSU with you, but I would like to start asking you, what does AMUSSU mean?
AMUSSU means movement in Tamazight.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to start discussing the context of the film. AMUSSU documents the protest of the people of Imider against the drainage of the community's water reserves by the Imider mine. The mine is operated by La Société Métallurgique d'Imider and owned by Société Nationale d'Investissement, a private holding company belonging to the Moroccan royal family. It is Africa's most productive silver mine, helping to make Morocco the 50th biggest silver production in the world. But Imider residents say the mine has drained their water reserves for decades and devastated their agricultural community. In 2011, the residents of Imider have shut the valve of one of the mine's biggest wells to stop the use of the village's groundwater, and if I understood correctly, have kept it shut since then, right? Mm-hmm. A movement was also founded, Movement on the Road 96, which is an environmental and social movement comprised of peasants, workers, shepherds, and unemployed youth from Imider. The movement has also produced AMUSSU. So could you tell us a little bit more about Movement on the Road 96 and about the historical and social context of this protest?
Sure. The Movement on Road 96, we can already see from the name that there's a 96 there, and the 96 is a reference to the last major uprising in the village in 1996, where there was a protest camp as well, and it lasted for 45 days. That protest camp was stopped by military forces, and one of the villagers was killed, which is why they have given this name to say that this movement, 2011 movement, is the continuity of the 1996 uprising. But the movement goes even further back to 1986, when there was the first uprising against the mine. And then even further back, I would say it even has its origins in anti-colonial resistance, which was one of the, and that in that region, it's one of the most, was one of the most fiercest resistances to the French occupation, and a resistance that lasted until 1933. So, which means that the French colonial forces came into Morocco in 1912. They couldn't control that region until 2 decades later, which is quite significant. This is the historical background. The movement was basically a blend of different interests in the community that coalesced around the movement. That you had unemployed youth who had just come back from the university, who were looking for jobs and couldn't find jobs. It's too expensive to continue living in the city, or they can't find any jobs in the city, so they come back. Then you have peasant women who are concerned about, and these are, I would say, are the majority of the movement, which were concerned about water for their fields. They're the ones, while men have tended to migrate to look for work elsewhere, women are the ones that kind of that are guardians of this land. So this was their major concern, was, well, when I turn on the tap at home to cook for my children, I need to find water. When I go to irrigate the fields, I need to find water. And then you had students as well. So you had a sort of blend between different interests that came together in the movement in 2011. And like you said before, they decided to shut down the water pipeline in order to have negotiating power with the mine, a sort of direct action, so that they could negotiate things like schools, better roads, employment, and most importantly, a stop to overexploitation of their aquifers.
Okay, I see. And we see in the film that a lot of these protesters get arrested. How long do they usually get arrested? Is it something, a small arrest, or do they stay long imprisoned, and how are they judged?
It ranges from a couple days to about almost 4 years.
Wow.
So, and it depends on the period of time when they were arrested. In the beginning, they were quite adamant on keeping people longer. So the first prisoners were the ones that had the longest prison sentences. But then when the movement started being mediatized in the international press, in the New York Times or in Al Jazeera, etc., then you had the state kind of back down, and you also had a huge international you had a lot of international solidarity. And so this sort of kind of helped protect the movement from further imprisonment, or imprisonment that would at least be years long, but a few days or a couple months. I mean, it's still prison, but
yeah,
at one point it came to a complete stop, and they stopped arresting people.
So making the film was in the beginning an initiative of the movement on the road, 96, right? It was, that's what I understood from reading a little bit about it. They decided to make their cause visible. How did you get in contact and involved in that?
So I knew the movement for a couple of years before the film. I was there. I visited them as an activist, especially because I'm most concerned by environmental causes and peasants' land rights movements, and so this was. a sort of mecca for me and a lot of activists in Morocco to go there because they were so successful. They had a very interesting way of organizing, which is horizontal, consensus-based, as opposed to the sort of traditional left kind of organizing that we find in the cities, which is very hierarchical, bureaucratic. And so out of frustration, I kind of cut away from this sort of bureaucratic left that you find in the cities, and decided to dedicate myself to that movement. So I helped them with things like translating manifestos or statements, graphic design, digital campaigns. For example, one time the mining company invited influencers like Instagram people and bloggers to come and visit their mines. And then they had this hashtag was sort of to kind of clean their image called MNG Discover. And we hijacked the hashtag. And so if you go into the hashtag right now, it's mostly, almost all of it is just things that are for the movement as opposed to for the mine. So things like this is how that our relationship began. And then for the film, they actually approached me a few weeks before the UN climate change conference that was in Marrakesh to make a short film that would basically, and we turned the short film, the title is actually also a hashtag 300 kilometers south, to basically say, well, 300 kilometers south of Marrakesh, where you're talking about climate change and the environment, one of the sponsors of that conference is doing this and this and this in our community. So the short film was a success. Many of the international activists that came to Marrakesh for the climate change conference had no idea about the movement, and the film helped bring attention to the movement, and even brought people from that came for the COP22 to visit Emedra, which was very important, I think, at that time. The feature film was sort of a mutual idea that kind of came out of this experience. That for me, on my end, I was quite frustrated with I was trying to make a fiction at the time, and I just couldn't get any funding for. And so I said, you know what, I'm just going to pick up a camera. There's this movement, it's happening now. It needs to be documented. So I'll give all my time to this because it needs to be documented. And that's basically how it came about. And of course, the movement was, I mean, I come from I would say a third cinema tradition. And so I'm looking at ways to make films collectively, and this came together very nicely with how they organized themselves. It was a very fluid kind of, we came together quite fluidly in how we saw how the film should be produced.
Yeah, talking about that, how everything came together fluidly and how the film was produced, it was a very particular way to do a film, because if I understood well, the whole movement and the whole community was involved in this film. There was a local film committee of Imider that was founded. It was governed by an agrau. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Okay. Sorry?
Agrau.
Agrau. Okay, I will try. So the agrau is the Indigenous General Assembly of Imider, but then many other agraus have been formed to supervise the making of the film. There was the General Agrau, the Writing Agrau, the Montage Agrau. Can you explain what an agrau is? Agrau is exactly, and also can you tell us more about this very innovative way of doing a film? How did that work?
So an agrau is a pre-colonial, I will call it an institution, a democratic institution. A lot of people think that, well, when we read about the history of North Africa, or actually any place in the world, we are often given these maps where there's this huge territory and they call it the empire of so-and-so, or like, for example, or the sultanate of such and such. But in reality, in these empires only controlled, in most cases, only controlled big cities and the roads in between. So you had these huge places in between where people governed themselves, or they didn't have a state in the way that we understand it today. In Morocco, we have a special name for these areas because Morocco was one of the last countries to be colonized. So these anarchical, if you will, zones were quite present until very recently in our history. And in the case of Emedar specifically, this Bled Siba, as we call it, this anarchical zone, lasted the longest in the region where Emedar exists. So this doesn't mean, and in a lot of films, Moroccan films, or actually any culture, actually any cinema or any narrative that we find about the state, we find that people often think that there was violence when there was no state. And Agro is actually proof of the contrary, that whereas the Sultan was one dictator who controlled the people that were in his zone of control, the people who lived outside actually had very diverse ways of governing themselves. Sometimes you did have people who were little dictators in little tribes, but you also had tribes that were democratic. And Agro is one of these kinds of forms of governance that you find amongst the more democratic tribes. And there's different names for it in different places. Agro is just the way that it's called there. And so the movement revived this democratic tradition, showing us basically and teaching me personally that democracy it's not France or the US that will teach us what democracy is. Did my internet? No, okay.
No.
That what democracy is, we don't need lessons from abroad, but we have models here. So it was very important for me to basically engage with this model, also get people to know about this model through this film, but also the way that we make it to reflect how powerful such a model is, where people can govern from below as opposed to governing from above. And so for me, this is a sort of model that can be applied to anything in our society, instead of one person deciding where a bridge should be built, destroying things in the process, not understanding whether that community needs that bridge there or here or wherever. We ask that community directly, where do you want that bridge to be? And I think this is how any society should function. And I think cinema is just one way to reflect a way of existing, or a way of organizing society. And I think that I don't agree with the capitalistic structures of film production and how they function in very hierarchical ways, where we have the producer is the one with the money, and so and director gives orders to people in the creative process, but rather acknowledging the fact that any filmmaker, any artist is already taking from people around them, already learning from people around them, and that any creative process involves discussion. And even if it's slower, democracy is slow in regards. It's easy to make decisions as a dictator or as an authoritarian. You could just say, well, I want it to be done this way, and that's how it's going to be done. And I think that we should revise how films are produced, and especially when we're making films about communities like this one, that we don't come with this very top-down perspective.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I was wondering if you can give us a concrete example as to how this really worked while making the film, because how did you decide on which scenes to shoot? How did you take decisions in the editing process? I'm really fascinated, and I would really like to know how this happened concretely, like Just a few, not the whole film. Yeah.
So we have the like you said earlier, you have the big agro. This is the agro that makes decisions for the movement. The film is just one of the many things on the agenda. So it's sometimes the film is a bit of something. It's like a pestering little thing that you have to deal with at the end of discussions about how to deal with political prisoners and how to deal with much bigger and more important issues. But it's there on the agenda. So you can't expect such a community to give all their energy and everybody all the time to give their energy to a film. So the big agro is just there sort of as the main producer, the person who's in charge. They're the ones who can call me up if they have questions about where the film is going. They're the ones who appointed the film committee, and it is also they're the ones that basically gave the yes, the consent for me to have the legitimacy to be able to film the movement. So they're the first step. They're the first thing that we do is we go to the agro and have their approval. And then at the end, we have their approval to screen the film and to show the film once it's done. So it's basically so that's where we get our consent. Then you have the local film committee, which is sort of like the executive producer. They deal with the day-to-day tasks of film production. They're mostly the more half of them are educated, or not educated, I would say literate youth who can take care of writing emails and looking at budgets and things like this. And the other half aren't necessarily, but they're still there in the discussions, and they have there's no difference between them. It's just when some can write emails and others can't, but they have as much say as anyone else. They also look at budgets. There's a lot of transparency to the process. So if I get a grant, I go to them, I say, I have this grant, and we talk about how the budget should be split up. Then you have, that's the local film committee. Then you have the agro for writing, which is a voluntary agro. Anyone can come and attend. And basically the way it functions is the way that any agro functions. The megaphone goes around, and each person gets, if they want, gets a turn to make a suggestion on how they see the question that's usually posed is, how do you see your film? And then usually what you have is that people, and I found this process very interesting because the suggestions that people were making were basically that they were suggesting that I film the things that they saw themselves contributing to the movement. So for example, while the women would say, film us making bread, film us collecting herbs, or the young man would say, film us repairing the pickup truck. So in fact, what you start to get is a sort of mosaic of what a social movement is made of. It's not made by presidents or any sort of politburo, but like movements are consisted of the very small actions that people take in their everyday lives, and it's in this accumulation of actions that we find historical change. So it was in this process that I sort of that's reflected in the film. You can see the film as a sort of mosaic or as a carpet where everybody has a piece of their thread inside. And it's an accumulation of many little gestures and actions that make up this historical social movement. And then you have the agro for montage. And this is, of course, later in the process, where once we have the first rough cut, we start to screen, periodically screen the film to the community, and they give us feedback, and we take the feedback into account. We have debates, we have discussions. Sometimes we don't really agree. Sometimes there's things in the film that I personally wouldn't have put in, but that they wanted in, and vice versa. We just have to convince each other why it's important that that be the decision that's made. This is part of the, like I said earlier, it's a democratic process. It's much slower. And this is why no production company would ever agree to this kind of process, because it does take time. And production companies are looking at the bottom line, they're looking at profits. And I think that cinema suffers a lot by making profit the bottom line for any film, and not expression, or looking at how to find ways or innovate cinematic expression. But besides that, you also have more informal. This is the formal structure. You also have informal aspects to this collective production, in the sense that you have, for example, when I have a particular person or a couple of people in front of the camera, they have, we don't want the community to be completely in control, but we also have to leave room for individuals within that community to have a say how they're being shown. So people would also put themselves in their own mise en scène. They would tell me, Nadir, film me from here. I will do this. This is how I always do it. This is how, and so they perform their own daily lives. Some people may say that this mise en scène is a fictionalization, but I would say that it actually, it's a reflection of things that are already happening, and that I'm just given the opportunity to film them in the way that people want me to film them. So basically, that's I won't take much longer, but that's basically how it kind of functions.
This is also very interesting when one looks at the narrative of the film, because this collectiveness and this democracy and this way of taking time, making the decisions together, and bringing in everybody in order to be able to tell the collective, is also how the narrative works of the film. You say yourself that you have a problem with the concept of a film author. You don't consider yourself as an author. You don't consider that a director is the author of the film. And you also have an issue with this European individualistic narrative within a film. Like, you never make interviews with your protagonists. You don't put the personal individual story at the center of the film. You film people interacting together, and through this interaction and the small stories of everyone, you create the collective story. Is this also something that you developed within your aesthetic, or is this something that happened through this collaboration?
I would say it's something that I developed through this film, but which was in my mind from much earlier. Like I said, I come from a third cinema tradition. For those who don't know what third cinema is, it's coming from, it started in Latin America in the 60s with a manifesto by Octavio Cretino and Fernando Solanas, who made the Hour of the Furnaces. And you had a lot of other filmmakers from Latin America that were writing about how to elaborate a collective film language, a truly popular cinema, not popular in the mass media consumption sense, but a truly a cinema by the people, for the people. And it's so this was kind of in the back of my mind for a long time, and I was trying to find a way, how could we apply it in this particular North African context. And so this collective method came, like I said earlier, it came very fluidly with the movement, because they had all the structures to make that possible. And I don't know if how easy it will be to repeat this kind of thing, this kind of process in another place where people aren't as solidified together. They don't have, they're not, they're not as, they have no agra or something that brings a whole community together like that. It would be very difficult to repeat it exactly in the same way. But of course, the collective process still interests me, even if it has to be reduced to a smaller scale. This was just really a huge deal because it was at a much larger scale. And for the auteur, I have some issues with this with this term for my, I mean, I don't see myself like you said. I don't see myself as being some sort of. The auteur is often associated with a genius, a visionary, someone who's who understands better or than the others, or is somehow floats above the rest of society, looking down and taking exactly the elements that he or she or they need to formulate some sort of genius artistic product. This is not how I see art production in general. I see art production in a very similar way that I see the historical process as an accumulation of many little gestures and actions that form, that change history. So in the same sense, I see myself as just one the chain link in in hundreds of years of artistic creation. And I mean, perhaps a good example would be by looking at carpet weavers, traditional carpet weavers in Morocco, who are often relegated to just being artisans, not artists, but artisans, because artisans are lower, are not truly artists. They're just repeating what people did before. Apparently, this is what the discourse around the difference between art and artisanat in French is. And I found that quite elitist, because I see it as a very paternalistic as a view, because we're looking at art as if it's the creation of just one individual, because we often say that the individual needs to innovate and create something new to be able to be an artist, that they can't repeat the same actions. But if you look at these carpets, it's actually, there are changes. They're very minute little changes that each generation of women or each woman introduces, but which accumulate over time and give us what we have today. So instead of seeing art as the creation of one individual, we could also look at art as an accumulation of millions of individuals over hundreds of years. And there's nothing more, I think, humbling or more something that shows how powerful humanity in its collectivity can be, and all of this collectivity and this power is actually coming from the creativity and even as minute as it is of individuals within this collectivity. So it's just a way of reformulating how we see artistic creation. It's not. And it's also, I mean, the term auteur is also an excuse to analyze films from the perspective of, I mean, the auteur film theory came from analyzing films by looking at who the maker is, who made the film. And I don't think this is necessarily always the best way. Sometimes it's useful, but is it really the best way for us to understand cinema? And unfortunately, auteur theory is probably the most dominant today in how we analyze films. So yeah, that's why I have a problem with the term auteur.
This is really very interesting, and unfortunately we don't have a lot of time, and I still would like to talk about a few things about the film, so I will have to not continue with this conversation that is compelling, but come back to AMUSSU, and also to come back also to the concept of the collective, because you said again about about the traditional narration, that AMUSSU replaces this narration, making extensive use of Islam in its seed. And Islam is the traditional poetry of the Amazigh people. In the beginning, in the introduction of AMUSSU, in the small introductionary text, you say that Movement on the Road present themselves as Imdiazen, indigenous rebel poets who document the struggles through song. So I would really like to talk about this particular point of the importance of oral history and of poetry for the people of Imder, but also for Movement on the Road, and about the specific use of poetry as a means for the struggle. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Of course. Well, there's a proverb, an Aitata proverb, which Aitata tribe is the tribe that Imedar belongs to, which is Tadis li ursemu. An event without its poem is an event which never happened. And this proverb speaks to how history was documented before the colonial period. There was no, people didn't write. The people documented history through poems and legends that were orally transmitted from generation to generation. And so, and up until today in the movement, you have a lot of women who are illiterate, but who have a lot to say, who are very educated, and who have they have an ideology, they have a way of seeing the world, and comes through their poetry. So, so it's only natural that we look at these oral poems as a source of understanding their perspective. And there's another aspect to oral poetry, and it has to do with the decolonization of cinema. And for me, one of the best ways, or one of the most potent ways to decolonize North African cinema, and I would even argue an African cinema in general, is by looking at our oral traditions. Instead of finding inspiration in European filmographies and American or Hollywoodian filmographies, well, we already had a storytelling tradition in Morocco, and so why not look at these oral art forms as a way to find a film language that's unique to our not only to our region, but to very specific localities, and it also has to do with a sort of, I call it it's sort of a battle of what I call monoculture. In the sense that we have a lot of film aesthetics are increasingly looking very similar to each other. If I watched an auteur film from Argentina and another one from France and another one from Senegal, it's going to look aesthetically, for me, some may disagree, but I find a lot of similarities in the narratives and how they're constructed, but also in the aesthetics, how the camera is moving. It has become repetitive. I mean, Netflix is, of course, like the epitome of this. But even in auteur cinema, we're starting to find that films from, I mean, when you look at Ousmane Sembène's films from Senegal in the 70s, there's a very particular Senegalese character to his cinema. It's not about so it's about diversity in the end. That when we base ourselves on these oral traditions, we're looking at something that's vernacular, local, as opposed to this globalized, homogenized sort of artistic production. That we need to create some things that are unique to us, and so looking for this vernacularity is very important for my work.
Okay, this is really all fascinating, and I wonder, do you have plans for another film or documentary or short film? Like, how are you going to, what are you going to bring us new? How are you going to apply all these things that you developed through AMUSSU into something new? Do you have an idea? Are you working on something right now?
Well, now I'm most of my time goes to a project, not a film project, but actually it has to do with the oral arts that I was just talking about, but a project for archiving through audiovisual means to create an oral history archive of all these disappearing oral art forms, whether they're work songs or folk tales or legends or any of the poetic, oral poetic forms, because I believe that these are things that will help filmmakers in the future, and not just filmmakers, also artists and researchers, find something to work with in the future before we all start to look alike and dress alike and speak alike in this world. So that's the project that takes most of my time right now. I am working on a multidisciplinary project between photography and video, but it's still in the works.
Okay, well, good luck with everything. I'm looking forward to hear more from you and from your works in the future. I am very happy, really very happy that we finally managed to have this talk, because it has been extremely interesting and enlightening to talk about all these topics with you. And before I leave, I would like to say goodbye to our audience. This was our last talk. Actually, not really goodbye, because we will be meeting in exactly 20 minutes for the closing ceremony of ALFILM with ALFILM's team. So I'm looking forward to see you again. But before I leave, I would also like to tell you that if you haven't watched AMUSSU or all of our films yet, tonight is the last evening of the films on our platform, but I would like also to bring to your attention the fact that if you buy the tickets this evening, they will still be available for 48 hours and you can plan your weekend in advance. So I hope that you will find something or many things that you would like to watch. And now I will leave you and see you again in 20 minutes. Good night.